Have you ever said yes to something before you even understood what you were agreeing to? Hello, girls. I'm Lena Fra, and today's story starts exactly there. And if you want these stories to go deeper, any more detail, more emotion, more chapters poo, Secret Stories Between Them is where that happens. Link is in the pinned comment.
There are exactly 2 rules I follow on the subway. Keep your eyes forward. Keep your headphones in. I've lived in New York for 3 years, and those 2 rules have kept me out of every conversation I didn't want to have. Every awkward eye contact situation, every "can I sit here" that turns into a 20-minute life story from a stranger. 3 years, perfect record. Until a Tuesday morning in October, when a woman in a suit that probably cost more than my rent sat down next to me and ruined everything. And I mean that in the best possible way. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Olivia. I'm 26 years old. I work the morning shift at a grocery store on Bedford Avenue, which means I'm on the L train by 6:45 every single day, half asleep, 1 coffee into what will eventually become a 3-coffee morning. I'm not miserable. I'm just paused. Like a movie someone hit pause on and then got distracted and forgot to come back to. My life is fine. My apartment is small. My 2 roommates are people I found on the internet and still don't fully understand. My social life is Sarah, who works the register next to mine and has an opinion about everything. And honestly, that's enough. I wasn't looking for anything. I especially wasn't looking on the subway at 6:45 in the morning. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to do something for me. If you're new here, welcome. Seriously, I'm glad you found this. Drop a comment below and tell me it's your first time, because I love knowing when someone new shows up. And if you've been here for a while, if you're one of the people who listens to these stories on your commute, or while you're cooking dinner, or hiding in the bathroom for 5 minutes of peace, comment and tell me you're still here. It genuinely means everything. Now, back to the woman in the suit. She sat down at Lorimer Street. I noticed her the way you notice anything expensive when you're not used to being around expensive things. The way the fabric of her jacket moved differently. The way she smelled like something that had a name I didn't know. The way she held her phone with the particular tension of someone receiving bad news and trying to look like they weren't. I noticed all of that, and then I looked back at the ceiling. Because that's what you do. You don't stare. That's the rule. Except she broke the rule first. She tapped my arm. Actually tapped it. Through the headphone force field that is supposed to be universally understood as, "do not engage." I pulled 1 earbud out. Just 1, because I wasn't committing. And I looked at her. Up close, she was even more the kind of person I had no business talking to. Sharp jaw. Dark eyes with the specific exhaustion of someone who's been awake solving problems since before the problems officially started. She looked at me like she was calculating something. "I know this is going to sound completely insane," she said. "Okay," I said. "Because what else do you say to that?" "I need a girlfriend. By Wednesday." She said it the way you'd say I need to file a report by Wednesday, or I need to schedule a meeting by Wednesday. Completely matter of fact. Like this was a reasonable thing to say to a stranger on public transportation before 7 in the morning. I stared at her for a moment. The train rocked. Someone's bag hit my knee. "It's Tuesday," I said. "I know. That's tomorrow." "I'm aware." I put my earbud back in. Not because I was done, I was absolutely not done, but because I needed 2 seconds to process what was happening inside the privacy of my own headphone bubble. I looked at the ceiling again. Then I looked back at her. She was still watching me, waiting, like she'd asked me something completely normal and was just giving me time to think it over. That was the moment I should have said no. That was the moment every reasonable person would have said no. I would like to formally state for the record that I have never claimed to be reasonable. Sarah found out at 9:47 in the morning, which is when we take our first break and stand by the loading dock eating whatever the bakery section marked down that day. It was a Tuesday, So there were sad croissants. I told her everything while she ate hers in 3 bites and stared at me with the expression of someone trying to determine if their best friend has finally, officially lost it. She didn't say anything for a long time. The loading dock hummed. A truck backed in. Sarah picked up a second croissant she hadn't been planning on eating and took a bite out of it the way people bite things when they need something to do with their hands. She tapped your arm, Sarah said. Yes. On the L train. That's what I said. Before 7 in the morning. Sarah. I'm just establishing the facts, Olivia. She pointed the croissant at me. You, who once refused to make eye contact with the guy who dropped his Metro card right in front of you, had a full conversation with a stranger in a suit, and then agreed to be her fake girlfriend for 2 days. She paused. Did you at least get her name? I had not gotten her name. I realized this for the first time standing on the loading dock at 9:47 in the morning, with a sad croissant in my hand, and Sarah looking at me like I was a case study. In my defense, the whole thing had taken maybe 4 minutes, and I had been running on 1.5 coffees and the disorienting experience of someone breaching the headphone force field at that hour. There had been a lot of information. The name had not made it into the intake. The message came at noon. A number I didn't recognize, which sent a single line. Sophie Whitmore. We should meet before Tuesday evening to align on details. Are you available after your shift? I read it 3 times. Then I showed it to Sarah, who read it 3 times. Then typed Sophie Whitmore into her phone with the focused energy of a person conducting a background check. What came up made her put the phone down slowly and look at me with an entirely new expression. Olivia, she said. That's the Whitmore group. I don't know what that is. They're like, her family basically owns a significant portion of several things. Sarah turned the phone toward me. There was a profile, a real one, the kind that appears in publications with one-word names. Sophie Whitmore, it said. Co-executive of Whitmore Group. Photographed at 3 different events in the past year, each one in a different suit, each one with the expression of someone who has been photographed enough times to know exactly how to look at a camera without giving it anything real. I texted back that I was free at 4. We met at a coffee shop on North 7th that I had walked past approximately 400 times and never gone into, because the kind of people who go into places like that are not generally the kind of people who work morning shifts at grocery stores on Bedford Avenue. Sophie was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a leather notebook open in front of her, and 2 coffees waiting, one on each side of the table, which meant she had ordered for me without knowing what I drank, which should have been presumptuous and somehow wasn't. She stood when she saw me. Actually stood. Like we were at a business meeting. Like I was someone you stood up for. You came, she said. You seemed like you needed help, I said, which was not what I had planned to say. I had planned something more neutral, more non-committal. My mouth apparently had other ideas. She walked me through the situation with the same efficiency she'd used on the train. Her grandfather, Edmund Whitmore, arriving Wednesday morning for a board meeting that was also, in the particular way of old money families, a performance. Her mother had mentioned a girlfriend in passing 3 weeks ago. Edmund had received this information like a gift and apparently held on to it. He was 79 years old, sharp as anything, and had opinions about stability that he expressed with the gentle persistence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He's not a bad person, Sophie said, and the way she said it told me this was something she'd had to remind herself of more than once. He just has a framework for what a life should look like, and mine doesn't fit it. It never has. But this proposal I'm presenting Wednesday, I need him to look at it without the framework getting in the way. She slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was an actual document. Terms, it said at the top. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the expression of someone who prepares documents for every significant event in their life, and has made peace with the fact that this is a personality trait. You wrote a contract? I said. It felt cleaner. For a fake relationship. For an arrangement, she said carefully, with clear parameters. I read it. It was 1 page, single-spaced, and it was the most organized thing I had ever held in my hands. Tuesday dinner with the family. Wednesday morning, brief appearance before the board meeting. All expenses covered. Compensation specified in a number that I read twice because the first time I thought I'd miscounted the digits. At the bottom, a single line that I kept coming back to. All interactions to remain within the bounds of comfortable and consensual performance for both parties. I looked up. Sophie was watching me read the way she'd watched me on the train, with that particular quality of attention that made you feel like the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. It was an uncomfortable feeling. Not bad uncomfortable. Just the kind of uncomfortable that lets you know something is happening that you hadn't accounted for. You spelled everything out, I said. I find it reduces misunderstandings. Do you write contracts for all your relationships? Something shifted in her expression. Not much. Just enough. No, she said quietly. Just the ones that matter. The coffee shop hummed around us. I looked at the document one more time. Then I picked up the pen she had placed without comment beside my cup. The problem with agreeing to pretend to be someone's girlfriend is that at some point you have to figure out what that actually means in practice. Sophie texted me a list, an actual bulleted list, formatted with subcategories, of things we needed to establish before Tuesday evening. How we met. How long we'd been together. What I did, which she phrased as your professional background, framed positively, in a way that made me stare at my phone for a full minute. What I thought about her work. What she thought about mine. Small details that couples know about each other without thinking, the kind that only become visible when you have to manufacture them from scratch in 48 hours with someone you met on public transportation. We met at her apartment Wednesday evening to go over everything. Her apartment was in Williamsburg, which surprised me. I'd expected Manhattan, glass and altitude, and a view that costs extra. Instead, it was a converted warehouse space, top floor, exposed brick and high ceilings and bookshelves that covered an entire wall from floor to ceiling in a way that looked less like decoration and more like a personality trait that had gotten out of hand. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. Sophie noticed me noticing and said nothing, which I was already starting to understand was a thing she did. She let silences exist without filling them, which is rarer than it sounds. You have a lot of books, I said. My grandfather used to say that a person's shelves tell you everything about who they are when no one's watching, she said. He meant it as a compliment. I've always thought it was a warning. I looked at the shelves. History. Architecture. 3 shelves of what appeared to be urban planning theory. One entire section that seemed to be dedicated to the history of specific cities, not travel books, actual dense historical texts with cracked spines and handwritten notes visible in the margins. And then, tucked at the end of one shelf like it had wandered in from a different life, a small collection of very battered paperback novels with the particular soft-cover look of books that have been read in the bath. Those are my mother's, Sophie said from behind me. She hadn't moved, but her voice was quieter. You kept them. She kept them here. There's a difference. A beat. Or there isn't. I haven't decided. We sat at her kitchen table with the list between us and went through it methodically. How we met. The subway. Which was true, and therefore the easiest lie we'd have to tell. How long? 3 months, short enough to explain gaps in shared history. Long enough to justify being brought to a family dinner. What I did, she wrote works in community retail infrastructure in her notebook with a completely straight face, and I laughed so suddenly it surprised both of us. She looked up. Something in her expression loosened, just slightly, like a door opening an inch. That's what you're going with? I said. It's accurate. It sounds like I manage a water treatment facility. Would you prefer something else? I scan groceries, Sophie. You can just say that. My grandfather will ask follow-up questions. Then I'll answer them. I leaned back in my chair. I'm not embarrassed about what I do. You don't need to dress it up. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between surprise and something quieter than surprise. Then she crossed out what she'd written and wrote grocery store in its place. Clean, simple, 2 words. She underlined it once, which felt like its own kind of statement. The rest of the rehearsal was where things got complicated. Not difficult complicated. The other kind. The kind where you're doing something functional and ordinary, and you gradually become aware that it doesn't feel ordinary at all. We practice the basic architecture of couplehood. Who reaches for who in a crowded room? Whether we use first names or something softer. How to field the question, "Tell me about her," without the 3-second pause that gives everything away. Sophie was precise about all of it. Efficient. She approached the whole exercise the way she probably approached every problem. Systematically, from the outside in. And then her grandfather called. She stepped away to answer it, moving to the window with her back to me, and I watched her without meaning to. The way her shoulders changed when she heard his voice, dropping maybe half an inch, the particular quality of ease that came into her posture that I hadn't seen there before. She laughed once at something he said. A real laugh, unguarded, nothing like the controlled version of herself she'd been presenting across the kitchen table. I looked away quickly, back at the list, because watching that felt like seeing something I hadn't been invited to see. When she came back, she stood at the edge of the table for a moment before sitting down. "He's excited," she said. Her voice was neutral. Her hands weren't. "About the meeting? About meeting you." She sat, picked up her pen, put it down. He said he could hear it in my voice when I mentioned you last week, that I seemed different. She wasn't looking at me. I told him people say that when they want it to be true. The apartment was quiet around us. Outside, the city made its city sounds, distant and constant and indifferent to whatever was happening in this kitchen. I thought about what to say and couldn't find anything that fit, so I said the true thing instead, which is usually either the best or worst option. "Are you different?" I asked. Sophie picked the pen back up, looked at the list. "We still need to cover what music you like," she said. "Edmund always asks about music." Sarah spent 45 minutes on Tuesday afternoon helping me get ready, which mostly consisted of her standing in my bedroom doorway, holding a cup of tea, and issuing verdicts on everything I owned. Too casual. Too much. Too you but not the you that owns a suit. The problem, which we both understood without saying, was that I didn't own anything designed for the specific situation of having dinner with a wealthy family while pretending to be their daughter's girlfriend, while actually being a stranger who met her on the subway 48 hours ago. That is not a category that most clothing is designed for. We settled on a dark green dress I'd bought for a wedding 2 years ago, and worn once, and Sarah held it up and said, "This says I'm serious, but I also have a personality," and I said, "That's the most I've ever asked a dress to do." And she said, "Welcome to your new life, apparently." The restaurant was in the West Village, the kind of place with no sign outside, and a menu that doesn't list prices because the prices are not the point. Sophie met me at the corner a block away, which I understood immediately. She wanted a moment before we walked in together, a chance to present as a unit rather than 2 people arriving separately. She was in navy, understated. Everything fitted exactly right in the way that money makes possible. She looked at me when I approached, and something passed across her face quickly. Approval, maybe, or relief, or something that wasn't quite either of those things but was in the neighborhood. "You look," she started. "Don't," I said. "I'm already nervous. Compliments will make it worse." She almost smiled. Noted. She offered her arm, the way people do in old films. and I took it because there was no version of this evening where I didn't. And we walked the last block together in the particular silence of two people preparing for something they can't fully prepare for. Edmund Whitmore was smaller than I expected. I don't know what I'd built up in my head, some large patriarch energy, substantial and formal. But the man who stood when we entered the private dining room was slight and silver-haired, and had eyes that were doing exactly what Sophie had warned me they would do, taking everything in, quietly, without appearing to. He took my hand in both of his when Sophie introduced me and said Olivia, like he was confirming something he'd already suspected. And I understood in that moment exactly why Sophie had been nervous about this dinner. "She talks about you," he said to me, warm and direct. "She talks about you too," I said, which was true. She had, across a kitchen table with a bulleted list between us, talked about him more than she probably realized. There were 4 others at the table. Sophie's mother, Catherine, who had the elegant exhaustion of someone managing many things simultaneously and doing it well. Her uncle Robert, who had the handshake of a man who has used handshakes as an assessment tool his entire adult life. Robert's wife, whose name was Diana and who immediately asked me how Sophie and I had met with the specific brightness of someone who already knew the answer and wanted to see how we told it. And Sophie's cousin, Vera, who was 24 and said almost nothing and watched everything and reminded me uncomfortably of myself. Sophie and I told the subway story the way we'd rehearsed it. She'd been on the train, unusual for her, a car breakdown, the crowded carriage. I'd been in my headphones. She'd tapped my arm. Here Edmund laughed, a real laugh, and said, "That sounds exactly like you, Sophie, direct as a hammer." And Sophie said, "Thank you, Grandpa," in a tone that suggested this was a comparison she'd received before and had decided to take as a compliment. What we hadn't rehearsed was how easy it would feel. Not easy effortless. There were moments I had to think fast. Moments where a question came from an angle I hadn't anticipated. But easy in the other sense, the sense of something that fits without forcing. When Edmund asked what I loved about my work, I told him the truth. That there's something grounding about a job where you see the same people every week, where you know Mrs. Papadopoulos buys the same yogurt every Thursday, and the guy from the 4th floor always forgets coffee and comes back for it. And Edmund listened the way people listen when they're actually listening, not waiting, and said that's community, simply and seriously, and I felt Sophie beside me go very still. Vera was the variable. She asked her questions from across the table with a precision that felt less like curiosity and more like examination. How long had we been together? Where had we spent the holidays? Whether I'd met Sophie's cat. I hadn't known Sophie had a cat. I covered the half-second of surprise by reaching for my water glass, and Sophie, without missing a beat, said, "She's terrified of Margot. She won't admit it." And I said, "I have a complicated relationship with that animal." And something about the ease of it, the way we fell into each other's sentences without planning to, made Vera narrow her eyes very slightly and say nothing more for the next 10 minutes. Halfway through the main course, Edmund turned to Sophie and said, quietly enough that it was almost private, "You seem settled. Not happy, not different. Settled. Like something had found its place." Sophie looked at him for a moment and then looked at me, and the look was brief and unreadable, and went somewhere I didn't have language for yet. "I think I am," she said. Under the table, without discussion, her hand found mine. Not performance. The table covered us completely. Edmund couldn't see. There was no audience for it. Just her hand and mine and the quiet fact of it. In the middle of a room full of people we were both, in different ways, trying to be enough for. I didn't move. Neither did she. We stayed like that, through the rest of the course. Through Edmund's story about a trip to Portugal in 1987. Through Vera's watchful silence and Catherine's careful conversation and the particular warmth of a room where, despite everything, something real was quietly happening. The dinner ended at 10:15. Edmund hugged Sophie at the door the way grandfathers hug, long, without rush, like time is something you give rather than spend, and shook my hand again and said, "I hope we see more of you, Olivia," in a tone that wasn't a pleasantry. It was a statement. The kind old people make when they've decided something and aren't interested in debating it. I said, "I hope so too," because it was the polite answer. And also, standing there on the sidewalk in the West Village at 10:15 on a Tuesday night, the true one. Sophie and I walked to the corner without speaking. The city was doing its nighttime thing around us, louder and softer at once, the way New York gets when the hard-edged daytime version of itself relaxes slightly into something more human. "Vera knew," I said. "Vera suspects," Sophie said. "There's a difference. She was watching us the entire time. Vera watches everyone the entire time. It's her primary hobby." She paused. "She voted against my proposal in the preliminary review. She'll vote against it again Wednesday, regardless of tonight." "Then why does it matter what she thinks?" "It doesn't," Sophie said, in the voice of someone for whom it matters. We stood at the corner where we should have said goodnight. The sensible geography of the evening pointed clearly in two directions: her building, my subway stop. And the sensible version of this arrangement pointed just as clearly toward a clean ending, a thank you, a see you tomorrow morning for the final act. That was the contract. That was the structure. I was aware of all of this, and stayed on the corner anyway. And so did she, and neither of us mentioned it. "Do you want to walk?" she said finally. We walked. No destination, no direction decided in advance, just the West Village at night, which is one of the few parts of this city that softens after dark instead of sharpening. Sophie had her hands in her coat pockets. I had mine crossed against the cold. We talked the way people talk when the formal version of a conversation has ended, and what's left is whatever was underneath it, slower, less linear, with longer pauses that didn't need filling. She told me about the proposal she was presenting Wednesday. Not the business version she'd given the table, the real version, the one underneath the slides and the projected figures. A community development project. Affordable housing integrated into a mixed-use space in a neighborhood that her family's company had historically treated as an investment opportunity and nothing more. "Edmund won't fully understand it," she said. "He'll approve it because he trusts me and because tonight helped, but he won't understand why it matters to me the way it does." "Why does it?" She was quiet for half a block. "Because I grew up watching what my family's decisions did to neighborhoods. From the inside of cars with tinted windows, which is the worst possible angle, close enough to see, far enough to pretend you didn't." She paused. "This doesn't fix that. I know it doesn't fix that, but it's a direction toward something." I thought about Mrs. Papadopoulos and her Thursday yogurt, the guy from the fourth floor and his forgotten coffee. The particular texture of a neighborhood where people know each other by habit and repetition, and the small, reliable rhythms of ordinary life. "I think Edmund understood more than you think," I said, "when you talked about community at dinner. He was listening to you, not the proposal." Sophie looked at me sideways. "You notice that. I notice things. I'm beginning to understand that." Something in her voice had shifted. Quieter, more careful, the way voices get when a conversation has moved somewhere the speaker didn't entirely plan to go. We had reached the river without meaning to, the way you sometimes do in this city when you're not paying attention to where your feet are going. The lights on the water did their thing. The bridge was lit. Sophie stood at the railing and looked out, and I stood next to her and did the same, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that means something rather than avoiding it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Why did you say yes? On the train?" She wasn't looking at me. "You didn't know me. It was an objectively strange request. You had every reason to put your earbud back in and get off at your stop." I thought about it. The real answer, not the deflecting one. "I think," I said slowly, "you looked like someone who needed help and wasn't used to asking for it. And I think that's a hard combination to say no to. A pause. Also, I was only on 1.5 coffees, and my judgment was compromised. She laughed, the real one again, the unguarded version I'd first heard through her kitchen window. It lasted only a moment, and then the night folded back around us, quieter for it. She turned to look at me, and the distance between us was the kind that happens without either person deciding on it. Close enough that I was aware of it, not so close that either of us had to acknowledge the fact that we were aware of it. "The arrangement ends tomorrow," she said, stating it plainly, the way she stated things. "I know." "After the presentation." "I know, Sophie." She nodded slowly, looking at the water. "I want you to know that tonight, what you did tonight with Edmund, with the table, that wasn't nothing. That wasn't performance, at least not entirely." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that information, but I wanted to say it out loud to someone. You're saying it to me. You're the only one here. That's not why, and you know it." The river moved. The bridge held its lights. Sophie looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I was starting to be able to read. Not fully, not completely, but enough to know that whatever was happening behind it was something she hadn't planned for and wasn't sure how to file. She straightened, took a breath, became, slightly, the version of herself that wore the suit. "You should get some sleep," she said. "The presentation is at 11. You don't have to come." "I know," I said. "We said goodnight at the corner properly this time, the way you say goodnight when you mean it, and also mean something else entirely that you're not ready to say yet." I took the subway home. I sat in my seat with my headphones in, music actually on this time, for once, and stared at the window and watched my own reflection not quite look back at me, and thought about a woman at a river railing, and the particular weight of a hand found under a table with no audience at all. Sarah texted at 11:43. "How was it?" I typed back. "Complicated." She replied immediately, "That's not a grocery store word, Olivia. That's a feelings word." I put my phone face down on my bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time before I went to sleep. I called in late to work for the first time in 2 years. I want to be precise about this because it matters to the story and also to my personal sense of identity. I have never called in late. Not once. I am the person who shows up early, who covers other people's shifts, who once came in with a fever because Mrs. Papadopoulos was having a procedure done, and I knew she'd need her yogurt, and nobody else would know which one. That is who I am. That is the contract I have with myself. So when I picked up my phone at 7:30 on Wednesday morning and called my manager and said I'd be in by noon, something had already shifted in a way I hadn't fully accounted for and wasn't ready to name. Sarah called 11 minutes later. She had heard from our manager, who had mentioned it in the group chat with the specific energy of someone reporting a minor natural disaster. I let it ring twice before picking up because I needed those 2 seconds to prepare for the conversation that was coming. "You called in late," Sarah said. "Good morning to you too. Olivia, you called in late." "People call in late, Sarah. It's a thing that happens. Not you." A pause, during which I could hear her recalibrating. "You're going to the presentation." It wasn't a question. Sarah has a particular gift for arriving at the true version of a situation before you've finished explaining the false one, which is both her best quality and her most inconvenient one. I didn't confirm it. I also didn't deny it, which she correctly interpreted as confirmation. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone choosing carefully among many things. "Does she know you're coming?" Sarah asked. "No." "Are you going to tell her?" Also, no. Another pause. "Olivia, Sarah, I need you to hear something." Her voice had changed, dropped out of the teasing register into something more direct, more honest. The voice she uses when she's decided that being funny is less important than being true. "You have talked about this woman every day for 3 days. You called in late. You went to the river with her at night, and came home and described the lights on the water to me in a voice I have never heard you use about anything. A beat. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing from where I'm standing. I sat with that for a moment. The apartment was quiet around me, my roommates already gone. The particular morning stillness of a space that belongs briefly only to you. Outside, the city was doing its relentless thing. Inside, I was sitting on the edge of my bed in a dark green dress I'd put on without entirely deciding to, thinking about river lights and a hand under a table and a laugh I'd only heard twice that I could already identify from across a room. I know, I said. Yeah, Sarah said. I know you know. The Whitmore group occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Park Avenue that had the particular architecture of institutions that have never needed to prove anything. Solid, understated, expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself. I arrived at 10:45 and sat in the lobby on a chair that was more comfortable than anything in my apartment, and watched people move through the space with the specific purposefulness of people who belong somewhere. I did not belong here. Every surface told me that quietly and without malice, the way true things sometimes present themselves. I belonged on the L train at 6:45 with my headphones in the staff entrance of a grocery store on Bedford Avenue, on the loading dock with Sarah and a marked-down croissant. I knew that. I had always known that. I stayed anyway. At 11:05, my phone buzzed. A text from a number I now had saved under a name. You're here, aren't you? Not a question. I looked up from my phone to find a small camera mounted in the corner of the lobby, which meant someone had checked, which meant someone had looked for me, which meant something I sat very still with for approximately 4 seconds. I typed back. Community retail infrastructure needed the morning off. The response took 30 seconds. Then, 3rd floor. Tell them Sophie sent you. They gave me a seat in a row of chairs along the wall of a conference room, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Midtown that was objectively extraordinary, and which I spent approximately 40 seconds appreciating before Sophie walked in, and the view became irrelevant. She was in charcoal today, a different suit, same bearing, the composed exterior she wore in professional spaces like a second skin. She was talking to someone as she entered, nodding at something being said, and then she found me across the room with her eyes the way you find something you've been looking for, without admitting you were looking. And for just a moment, half a moment, the composure shifted. Not much, a fraction. The door opening an inch. Then she was at the front of the room and the presentation began. I had expected something polished and distant, numbers and projections and the careful language of people who move money for a living. What I got was Sophie, the real version, the one from the kitchen table and the river railing. She talked about the neighborhood the way I'd talked about Mrs. Papadopoulos at dinner, not as an asset or a metric, but as a place where people lived their actual lives. She used words like accountability and obligation in a room full of people who were used to hearing opportunity and return, and she said them without apology or softening, the way you say things when you've decided they're true, and the audience's comfort with them is not your primary concern. Edmund was in the front row. He listened the way he'd listened at dinner, fully, without performance. Vera was 2 seats down from him with her assessment face on. Robert was taking notes. Catherine, at the back, caught my eye once and gave me something that was almost a smile and looked quickly away. The presentation lasted 35 minutes. When it ended, the room did the thing rooms do when something has landed, a beat of genuine quiet before the professional response kicks in. Edmund asked 2 questions, both of them good ones, the kind that come from actually listening. Sophie answered them the way she'd answered me at the river, directly, without hedging, with the particular confidence of someone who has thought about something long enough that the thinking has become part of them. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was enough. I watched Sophie receive the result with the stillness of someone who had prepared for both outcomes and was now, quietly, processing the one that had actually arrived. She thanked the room, shook hands, said the right things in the right order, and then the room began to empty, and she moved toward the door, and I moved toward it too, and we met in the corridor outside, with the noise of the building around us, and the particular feeling of something that has been held tightly, finally being allowed to rest. She looked at me for a long moment. "You came," she said. "You noticed," I said. Immediately. A pause. It helped. "The presentation was already good, Sophie." "I know," she said. "It still helped." The corridor emptied slowly around us the way corridors do after significant things happen in the rooms they connect. People filtering out in 2s and 3s, voices dropping to the particular register of post-meeting decompression, the specific institutional exhale of a building returning to its ordinary Tuesday self. Except it was Wednesday. And nothing about the last 48 hours had been ordinary by any measure I had previously applied to my life. Sophie and I stood in the middle of all of it, and neither of us moved toward the elevator, and neither of us moved toward anything else in the arrangement, which had technically concluded approximately 4 minutes ago when the vote came in, sat between us like a door neither of us had decided yet whether to open or close. Edmund found us before we found words. He came out of the conference room with Robert and stopped when he saw me, and his face did the thing it had done at dinner, that particular quality of warm recognition, like confirming something he'd already privately decided. He shook my hand again with both of his and said, "You were here," simply and directly in a way that managed to mean several things at once without specifying any of them. Then he looked at Sophie with an expression that fathers and grandfathers have been deploying for centuries, the one that says, "I see more than you think I do, and I'm choosing not to say all of it." And he said, "Good work today," and moved on down the corridor with Robert and was gone. Vera passed us without stopping, but she looked at me once, briefly, on her way to the elevator, and gave me a nod that was small and unreadable and felt, coming from Vera, like the closest thing to a white flag that her particular personality was capable of producing. I filed it away. Sophie watched her go and said nothing. "Your grandfather knew," I said. "Edmund knows everything," Sophie said. "He just decides what to do with the information on his own timeline." She paused. "He approves," in case that wasn't clear. "Of the proposal?" "Of you." She said it without looking at me, which somehow made it more rather than less significant. "He texted me during the break. He said—" She stopped. "He said some things that I'm not going to repeat because they'll make this moment very complicated. This moment is already very complicated." "I know." We stood there in the emptying corridor with the complication between us, which was not nothing and not something that fit cleanly into any of the categories I had for things in my life. I had a category for work, and a category for Sarah, and a category for the small, reliable rhythms of a life that asked nothing dramatic of me. I did not have a category for this. For a woman in a charcoal suit in a corridor on Park Avenue who had tapped my arm on the L train 48 hours ago, and somehow, without either of us planning it or signing off on it or including it in the clearly formatted terms of a one-page document, had become someone I thought about in the particular way you think about people who have gotten into a part of you that you usually keep the door closed on. "The arrangement is over," Sophie said, still stating things plainly, still giving me the true version first. "I know. There's no obligation. From this point, the terms were clear. Sophie, I know what you're doing," I said. "You're giving me the exit because you wrote it into the contract and you want to make sure I know it's there." I looked at her. "I know it's there." She looked back at me. The composure was still in place, but it was doing the thing it had done twice before. The door opening an inch, the fraction of shift, the version of Sophie that didn't perform anything because it had forgotten briefly that performance was an option. "And," she said quietly. "And I called in late to work for the first time in 2 years," I said. "I put on a dress. I took the subway to Park Avenue and sat in your lobby on a chair that's nicer than my couch and watched you present something that you built from a real place to a room full of people who needed to hear it. I paused. I didn't do that because of the contract. The corridor was almost empty now. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator opened and closed. The building breathed its quiet, institutional breath around us. Sophie was very still in the way she went still when something was happening that she hadn't planned for and didn't know yet how to categorize. I understood that feeling. I was living it in real time. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Not the professional voice. The other one. The kitchen table voice. The river voice. The voice that existed underneath the suit and the composure and the one-page contracts with clearly formatted terms. "I know how to do everything in that room." A gesture toward the conference room behind her. "I don't know how to do whatever this is." "Neither do I," I said. "I work a register on Bedford Avenue. I take the L train. I eat sad croissants on a loading dock with my best friend. I have never once in my life been in a building with a view like that." I looked at her. But I knew, on the river last night, that I didn't want Tuesday to be the last time we talked without a reason to. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that isn't absence, the kind that's full of something moving toward a shape. When she spoke, her voice was careful, and also, underneath the careful, something that had stopped pretending to be something else. "There's a coffee shop," she said. "On Jane Street. I've been going there for 4 years and I've never taken anyone." A pause. "It's nothing impressive. It's actually quite small, and the chairs are uncomfortable and they only have one kind of pastry." "What kind?" "Almond croissant." Something loosened in my chest that I hadn't realized had been held tight. "I have opinions about croissants," I said. "I assumed you might. They'd better not be sad ones." "They're not sad," she said, and almost smiled. "They're quite good, actually." We took the elevator down together and walked out of the building onto Park Avenue where the Wednesday afternoon was doing its ordinary thing. Cabs and pedestrians, and the general indifferent machinery of a city that doesn't pause for personal revelations. Sophie fell into step beside me and I fell into step beside her, and we walked the way we'd walked the night before. No destination formally declared, direction established by something quieter than decision. Her shoulder was close to mine, not touching. The almost, which had been there from a train at Lorimer Street and a tap on an arm through a headphone force field, which had lived in every carefully maintained inch of appropriate distance across a kitchen table and a restaurant and a river railing, gathered itself into the specific weight of something that had been patient long enough. On Jane Street, she stopped in front of a door so unmarked I would have walked past it without registering it. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked at me, and the look was the real one, the unguarded version, the one I'd been catching in fractions since Tuesday morning, and was now getting in full, something open and uncertain, and more honest than anything a one-page contract could have produced. "No terms this time," she said. "No terms," I agreed. She opened the door. The smell of coffee and warm pastry came out to meet us. Inside it was small and slightly crowded, and the chairs were, as advertised, not particularly comfortable. And at a corner table, a spot opened up as we stepped in. The way spots sometimes do in cities when you need them to. As if the universe occasionally decides to be cooperative about small things, even when it's being opaque about large ones. We sat. The coffee came. The almond croissant arrived on a small plate between us and was, as promised, not sad. It was the good kind, the kind with layers, the kind that takes actual effort. I broke off a piece and Sophie watched me try it with an expression of someone awaiting a verdict they care about more than they'd planned to. I chewed. She waited. "Okay," I said. "Okay good, or okay acceptable?" "Okay, you were right," I said. "Which I imagine doesn't happen to you very often." "More than people think," she said. "Less than I'd like." And we sat there in the small, uncomfortable chairs in the unmarked coffee shop on Jane Street, with no arrangement between us and no contract and no occasion, and no Wednesday deadline. Just two people and coffee and a croissant worth taking seriously, and the conversation moved the way conversations move when nobody is performing anything. Slowly at first, then with the ease of something finding its natural current. She told me about the first time Edmund brought her to a board meeting, age 9, in a dress she'd chosen herself, and shoes that didn't fit. I told her about the first time I covered a full shift alone, age 17, and dropped an entire display of canned tomatoes and had to rebuild it while customers walked around me without comment. She laughed. I laughed. Outside on Jane Street, the city went about its business. At some point, the coffee was finished and neither of us mentioned it. The croissant was gone, and neither of us mentioned that either. The afternoon had done the thing afternoons do when you're not watching, moved quietly toward evening without asking permission, the light through the window shifting from the sharp particular gold of a New York autumn afternoon to something softer and less certain. Sophie looked at me across the small table in the small, uncomfortable chair, and the look had no category I could put it in, except the true one, which was that somewhere between a tap on the arm on the L train and a corridor on Park Avenue and a river at night and an unmarked door on Jane Street, something had happened that had nothing to do with Wednesday and everything to do with whatever came after it. "Same time next week?" she said. Like it was simple. Like it had always been simple. Like two people deciding to come back to a place was the most ordinary thing in the world, which it is, and also the least ordinary thing in the world, which it also is, depending entirely on who the two people are. I looked at her. She looked at me. The coffee shop hummed around us with the sound of a place that has held many conversations and keeps none of them, which is the right policy for a place like this. "Same time," I said. Sarah found out the real way, not from me telling her, but from seeing it with her own eyes on a Saturday morning when she came into the store to buy milk and found me on my break in the staff entrance talking on the phone with the particular quality of attention that you give to a voice you've been waiting to hear all morning. She stood there with her milk and watched me for approximately 4 seconds, and then sent me a text from 8 feet away that said simply, "Oh no. Oh no, you didn't." I looked at my phone, looked at her, and mouthed, "Stop it." She mouthed back, "I knew it," and went to self-checkout with the expression of someone who has been vindicated by the universe and intends to enjoy every second of it. The coffee shop on Jane Street became a weekly thing, then a twice-weekly thing, then the kind of thing that stops being scheduled because it has become simply what Tuesday and Thursday afternoons are for. Sophie learned that I take my coffee with 1 sugar, and remembered without being reminded, which sounds small and isn't. I learned that she eats the almond croissant from the outside in, systematically, saving the densest center for last, which is either a personality trait or a philosophy, and possibly both. We argued about it once, genuinely argued, and it was the best conversation I'd had in years. She won, technically. I maintain she got lucky. The thing about falling for someone you weren't looking for is that you can't identify the exact moment it happened, because there wasn't one. There was no single Tuesday where I went to bed not in love with Sophie Whitmore, and woke up Wednesday changed. It was more like a tide, the kind that moves so gradually that you only notice when you look down and realize the shore you were standing on is somewhere behind you, and you've been in the water for longer than you knew. 6 weeks after Wednesday, I was standing in the water. I had been for a while. I was just, finally, willing to say so out loud. We were on the roof of her building on a Saturday evening in late November when it happened. She had a rooftop she barely used because she was always working, and I had been making a case for weeks that this was a waste of a perfectly good sky. She'd finally conceded, brought a blanket, 2 coffees, the particular willingness of someone who has decided to let someone else be right about something for once. The city was doing its winter thing below us, cold and lit and relentless. Up there it was quieter than it had any right to be. We were sitting close enough that the blanket covered both of us without discussion, which had become a thing we did, moving into each other's space without announcing it, without making it a moment, letting it simply be true. She was telling me about Edmund. He'd called that morning, as he called every Saturday, and had asked after me by name the way he always did now. Not, "How is your friend?" or "How is the girl from the subway?" but "How is Olivia?" with the particular warmth of someone who has decided you belong in the story and is no longer asking permission about it. Sophie told me what he'd said, and her voice had that quality it got when she talked about him. Softer, less defended. The version of herself that existed before she learned that boardrooms require armor. "He asked if you make me happy," she said. The city hummed below us. I looked at her. She was looking at the skyline, her profile against the dark with the lights of Midtown behind her, and I thought about a train at Lorimer Street, and a tap on an arm and a one-page document with clearly formatted terms, and a corridor on Park Avenue, and an unmarked door on Jane Street, and 6 weeks of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and the specific irreversible feeling of a tide that has already moved. "What did you tell him?" I said. She turned from the skyline and looked at me instead, and the look was the real one, the fully open version. Nothing held back, nothing managed, nothing performed for any room or any audience or any occasion except this one, which was just a rooftop and a blanket, and 2 coffees going cold, and the simple available fact of us. "I told him yes," she said. Completely, unexpectedly, and without any terms whatsoever. I looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then I leaned over and rested my head on her shoulder, and she shifted to make room for it the way you shift for something you've been expecting, and her hand found mine under the blanket the way it had found it under a restaurant table 6 weeks ago, quietly, without announcement, as if this was simply where it had always been going. Below us, the city kept its relentless noise. Above us, the sky did what skies do. And on a rooftop in Williamsburg on a Saturday evening in November, with no grandfather to convince, and no contract between us, and no Wednesday deadline driving anything at all, Sophie Whitmore and I stayed exactly where we were until the cold made staying impractical, and then stayed a little longer anyway, because some things are worth the cold, and this, whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, whatever it already irreversibly was, this was one of them.